They call it paradise on earth. But behind the snow-capped mountains, the saffron fields, and the silence of Dal Lake lies a truth the world doesn't want to hear. A truth buried under decades of betrayal, barbed wire, and broken promises. This is not just a story of a land. It is the cry of a people stripped of their rights, a people silenced behind curfews, a people who still hold on to hope, even when the world has looked away. If you believe that every voice deserves to be heard, stay with us. Watch till the end, because the world may have forgotten Kashmir, but we haven't. Like, share, and most importantly, listen, because Kashmir is not just a place. It is a pain that demands to be remembered. They call it paradise, a land where mountains kiss the sky and rivers whisper secrets to the valleys below. But beneath the majestic silence of Kashmir lies a storm that has raged for decades, a storm of grief, loss, and longing. The wind that blows through the china trees carries more than the scent of saffron and snow. It carries the unheard cries of mothers, the prayers of fathers, and the dreams of children who have grown up with the sound of gunfire instead of lullabies. In the heart of this breathtaking valley, time seems to have stopped, not in awe, but in mourning. Kashmir, once known for its poetry and peace, has become a prison for its own people. Barbed wires wrap around villages like shackles. Soldiers patrol streets that once echoed with laughter. Cameras watch every corner. And the people? They walk with eyes lowered, hearts heavy, and voices silenced, not by choice, but by force. The pain here isn't new. It didn't arrive overnight. It crept in quietly, over years of broken promises, ignored resolutions, and blood-stained winters. Every generation has inherited sorrow as if it were a family heirloom. Ask a Kashmiri child what freedom means, and he might describe a day when he doesn't have to carry his ID card to school. Ask a mother what peace looks like, and she might recall the face of her son before he disappeared. Never to return, never to be found. This is not just a political conflict. It is a human tragedy. It is the tale of a people torn between borders they never chose. In 1947, when the subcontinent was divided, Kashmir was caught in a storm it didn't ask for. Promises were made to its people. Promises of self-determination, of dignity, of a voice. But the promises have turned into echoes, repeated again and again in hollow chambers while the valley weeps in silence. And yet, the world watches from a distance, as if Kashmir is a faraway dream, too complex to understand, too dangerous to discuss. But the truth is simple. It is the story of a people who want to live in peace, who want the right to decide their future, who want to be heard. Is that too much to ask? In the early mornings, when the fog lifts from the Dal Lake, shikaras float quietly across the water. From a distance, it looks peaceful. Tourists take photos, couples smile, and the illusion of calm hangs like mist. But just behind the lake, in the narrow lanes of Srinagar, lives a very different reality. Armed forces stand guard at every checkpoint. Families live in fear. Journalists disappear. Dissent is criminalized. The land of saints and poets has become a battlefield of narratives. Inside Kashmiri homes, life goes on, quietly, cautiously. Mothers fold prayer mats with trembling hands. Fathers peek through curtains each time there's a knock on the door. Children grow up fast here. They learn to differentiate between the sound of a firecracker and a bullet. They learn to run when the boots march in. Their drawings are not of sunflowers and rainbows, but of soldiers, bunkers, and bleeding hearts. And yet, in this valley of tears, hope refuses to die. It lives in the voice of an old poet reciting verses in the shadow of a curfew. It lives in the eyes of a girl who dreams of becoming a doctor, even when her school is shut for months. It lives in the smile of a father who still waits for his missing son, lighting a candle each night by the window. It lives in resistance, not of violence, but of resilience. Kashmir is not silent. It is silenced. There's a difference. The people have spoken, in whispers, in poetry, in protest, in pain. But their voices are drowned in the noise of politics, propaganda, and power games. Every time someone labels them, defines them, or reduces them to pawns in a geopolitical puzzle, they strip away a piece of their humanity. But Kashmiris are not pawns. They are poets, farmers, teachers, mothers, fighters of a different kind, fighters for truth, for justice, for their identity. And no matter how long the night may be, they still believe that dawn will come, that one day the chains will break, that one day the Chinas will bloom without fear, that one day their story will be told not in numbers, not in casualty lists, but in their own words. Until then, the valley waits, with its rivers of sorrow and mountains of memories, with its wounded heart and unbroken spirit, with songs buried in the snow and truths written in blood. Kashmir waits, not for sympathy, but for justice. In the autumn of 1947, while most of the subcontinent celebrated its newfound freedom, the Valley of Kashmir stood on the edge of uncertainty. Partition had divided not just lands, but hearts. Borders were redrawn with blood. And in the midst of this chaos, Kashmir became the victim of a decision that would haunt generations. Maharaja Hari Singh, the Dogra ruler of Kashmir, hesitated between joining India or Pakistan. His people, mostly Muslim, had no voice in the matter. Their future was being decided in faraway capitals, behind closed doors. Then came the tribal invasion from Pakistan, an event that changed everything. The Maharaja, desperate and terrified, signed the Instrument of Accession with India, a document wrapped in controversy, rushed in fear, and signed in haste. And just like that, without the will of its people, Kashmir became part of a new conflict, one that would never truly end. Indian troops landed in Srinagar under the pretext of protecting the valley. But to many Kashmiris, it felt like the beginning of an occupation, not a rescue. Soon after, the United Nations stepped in. A ceasefire was declared in 1949. The world acknowledged that Kashmir was not a settled matter. UN Resolution 47 was passed, promising a plebiscite, a vote that would allow the Kashmiri people to decide their own fate. But the vote never came. The promise was left to rot in the cold mountain winds of the Himalayas. What hurts a people most is not just injustice, but betrayal. Kashmiris were betrayed by history, by politics, by those who spoke of peace but planted seeds of power instead. The valley was split, one part administered by Pakistan, the other by India. Families were torn apart, identity fractured, a paradise divided. But the wounds weren't just geographical. They were emotional, cultural, spiritual. A whole generation grew up under the weight of what could have been. Every time a Kashmiri looked across the border, they saw what was once part of their own land. They saw the pieces of a dream that never came true. What followed were decades of broken trust. Every political step was a new scar. In 1953, Sheikh Abdullah, the man who once aligned with India, believing in autonomy and self-rule, was arrested by the very government he supported. His crime? Asking for the rights promised in the Instrument of Accession. For Kashmiris, this was yet another betrayal, another signal that promises were not meant to be kept. The years that followed saw a slow erosion of Kashmir's autonomy. Article 370, which was supposed to guarantee special status, became a legal shell picked apart by presidential orders, diluted piece by piece. Delhi's grip tightened, and Srinagar's voice weakened. Elections were rigged, leaders handpicked, dissent crushed. The spirit of democracy was mocked in the very land where it was promised most loudly. Outside the valley, the world moved on. But inside Kashmir, history remained frozen in 1947. The pain never healed, because the wound was never allowed to close. Every generation was taught about the betrayal, not just by books, but by living it. Grandfathers spoke of the days when there was hope. Fathers remembered the protests, the crackdowns. Sons watched the soldiers march in again and again with their rifles and shields and wondered, how do we end up here? The valley became a place of memory. Each street corner, each village, each mountain trail, marked by stories of longing, loss, and waiting. And still, the people hoped. They hoped the world would remember that they were promised a voice. They hoped someone would ask why a democratic world could stay silent while an entire population was denied the right to choose. But hope could be fragile, and when it is broken again and again, it turns into anger, into despair, into resistance. By the 1980s, frustration turned into fire. Kashmiris began to rise, not as militants at first, but as protesters, as citizens who believe they deserve the rights promised to them decades ago. But instead of listening, the response was bullets. Thousands disappeared. Many more were killed. Mass graves filled the silent hills. Mothers waited by their doors. Fathers knocked on army camps, begging for answers. And the world still looked away. All of it, every protest, every uprising, every stone thrown by a boy in defiance, is rooted in 1947, in the moment when Kashmir's fate was sealed not by its people, but by those who thought they knew better. That decision, made in a rush without consent, has cost more lives than history dares to count. And yet, despite everything, the people of Kashmir have not forgotten who they are. Their culture, their language, their stories still survive. Every Kashmiri child grows up with two histories, the one taught in school and the one whispered at night by elders. The real one, the painful one, the one that begins in 1947 and hasn't ended yet. To understand Kashmir, you don't need to read treaties or analyze military strategies. You need to hear a mother cry for a son who never returned. You need to see a schoolgirl pick up a pen under the shadow of a gun. You need to stand by the banks of the Jhelum and listen to its waters speak of stories no one dared to write. Kashmir is not just a conflict. It's a people denied their right to dream, to choose, to live with dignity. And it all began with betrayal that was never acknowledged, never corrected, and never forgotten. When the sun rises over Kashmir, it does not bring the warmth of a new day. It brings fear. It brings uncertainty. It brings the echo of boots on gravel and the distant crackle of loudspeakers announcing another curfew. In most places, a curfew is rare. In Kashmir, it's routine, a way of life, a command that turns homes into prisons and silence into a language understood by all. For decades, the people of Kashmir have lived under the gaze of 1,000 guns. Armed forces are not visitors in the valley. They are its shadow. They stand at crossroads, on rooftops, outside schools, inside marketplaces. Their presence is constant, their authority unquestioned, and the people walk among them like ghosts, seen but voiceless. The cry for freedom is not new here. It rises with the morning azan and lingers long after nightfall. It's not just a political slogan. It is a heartbeat, a yearning, a cry born of generations who have known no other reality. When the streets fill with protesters, their chants are not of hatred, but of heartbreak. They do not demand war. They demand dignity. They demand the right to live without fear, to speak without consequence, to exist without suspicion. But the response is always the same: tear gas, rubber bullets, pellet guns. The eyes of Kashmir's youth have become targets. So many boys, some as young as 12 or 13, have lost their sight, not in accidents, but in protests. They marched with stones in their hands and were answered with metal. Hospitals in the valley have become halls of grief, beds filled with wounded eyes, stitched faces, and broken bones. And yet they rise again, the very next day, with bandages over their eyes and fire in their hearts. This is not rebellion. This is resistance, a resistance that says, we exist, we matter, we remember. But it's not just the streets that bleed. Homes, too, have become battlefields. Midnight knocks, forced entries, arbitrary detentions, young men dragged out without warrants, families torn apart without explanation, mothers weeping in corridors of interrogation centers, fathers standing in courtrooms that offer no justice. And behind every missing son is a sister who waits, a grandmother who prays, and a story that the world refuses to hear. In Kashmir, freedom of speech is a myth. Journalists who try to report the truth are harassed, silenced, or banned. Newspapers are censored. Internet is shut down at will. Mobile networks go dark whenever the state feels threatened, not by violence, but by truth. The digital blackout is not just control of data. It is a control of identity, of memory, of narrative. And while the valley is sealed off, the outside world hears only what it is told. That is about terrorism. That is about security. But those who live in Kashmir know the truth, that this is not about eliminating militants. This is about eliminating a voice, a dream, a people's right to determine their own destiny. In every home, there is a story of loss, of survival, of love tested by fear. A girl who buried her father and still went to school the next day. A mother who makes tea for her son, even though he's been gone for 3 years. A grandfather who teaches his grandchildren not hatred, but poetry, because poetry in Kashmir is not just art, it is rebellion, a way of remembering without shouting, a way of saying, we are still here. The psychological war is even more cruel. Children grow up learning to identify uniforms more than butterflies. They know the difference between AK-47s and INSA's rifles. They know where to hide when the sirens wail. This is not childhood. This is conditioning. A generation raised not on bedtime stories, but on survival instincts. The women of Kashmir carry a double burden. They are caretakers and witnesses. They watch over their families while carrying the trauma of war in their eyes. They wait in protest camps. They testify in inquiry commissions. They dig through police records. And when nothing works, they pray. Their resilience is quiet but unbreakable. And through all this, the cry for freedom does not fade. It evolves. It becomes art, music, slogans, graffiti. It becomes the whisper between lovers, the lullaby sung to infants. It becomes a silence after a funeral and a defiance in a schoolgirl stare. This freedom is not just about politics. It is about identity, about history, about the right to dream. And what does the world do? It looks away. Or worse, it takes side without listening. Kashmiris don't need sympathy. They need truth. They need people to stop seeing them as statistics or suspects and start seeing them as humans. Humans who laugh, love, bleed, and hope. Even in the darkest days, the people of Kashmir look to the sky, the same sky that has watched their suffering for decades. They believe that above the clouds, beyond the drones and helicopters, there is still a sun that remembers them, and they wait for it to rise, not just over their land, but over their lives. In the quiet corners of the valley, a new generation is growing. They carry the pain of their ancestors, but also a spark. They write poems on walls. They study law and history. They speak with clarity, not anger. They are not asking for revenge. They are asking for recognition, for justice, for peace. And maybe one day, when the world finally listens, the curfews will end, the checkpoints will disappear. The eyes of a youth will shine with dreams, not blood, and the cry for freedom will no longer echo in pain, but in pride. Until then, Kashmir remains under siege, not just by soldiers, but by silence. Some wounds are so deep they do not bleed, they echo. In the cold air of Kashmir, those echoes still ring. They travel through the valleys, across the rivers, and into the hearts of generations who were not even born when the blood was spilled. These are the stories you want to remember, but no Kashmiri can forget. It was January 21st, 1990, Gokado Bridge in Srinagar. Protesters had gathered, unarmed, marching against the arbitrary arrests and house raids that had become routine. The city was tense. The people were angry, but they held no weapons, only placards, chants, and raw courage. As they reached the bridge, paramilitary forces opened fire without warning. The gunshots tore through the fog, through the flesh, through the future of dozens of families. Bodies fell like leaves in winter, some into the water, some onto the cold steel. Eyewitnesses spoke of over 50 dead, though the official count remains contested and the truth blurred. But for those who lost their sons, their brothers, their fathers, no number will ever be just a statistic. That day, the Jhelum carried more than water. It carried martyrs. But Kashmir was not given time to grieve. One tragedy was barely buried when another was born. Just a month later, on the night of February 23rd, 1991, the twin villages of Kunin and Pashpra face a nightmare that history rarely dares to repeat. Soldiers descended in the darkness under the guise of a search operation. Men were dragged out, interrogated, tortured. But the real horror unfolded in the homes left behind. What happened next is whispered even today in hushed voices, in living rooms under candlelight, behind closed doors. Dozens of women, from young brides to grandmothers, were raped that night, violated, silenced, and then left to pick up the pieces in a society where shame clings like a second skin. The state denied the allegations. The army called it propaganda. Investigations were botched, delayed, or buried. And those women, they lived, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. They raised children. They carried the shame they never deserved. They faced taunts, stigma, and silence. But they never stopped speaking. They fought for justice, even when the world tried to forget them. These are not isolated events. They are pages of a long, dark book that Kashmiris know by heart. Sapor, Handwara, Bijbara, Kupvara, names that do not appear on travel maps, but in court files, furs, and in the nightmares of survivors. Massacres occurred not just in jungles and alleyways, but in daylight, under flags that were supposed to protect. Every year, January and February return not with snow and beauty, but with memory and mourning. And then there are those who didn't even get the dignity of being remembered, that disappeared. Thousands of men taken over the years, picked up during raids, arrested without charge. Some were never seen again. Their families searched morgues, jails, mass graves. They carried photos to protests, to officials, to the media. And when everything failed, they carried them in their hearts. These are the half-widows of Kashmir, women whose husbands are neither alive nor dead. They wait in limbo, year after year, caught between hope and heartbreak. There are unmarked graves across the valley, hundreds of them, in forests near army camps, hidden by wild grass and silence. Human rights organizations have raised alarms. DNA tests have been demanded, but no answers come. The soil of Kashmir does not only grow apples and tulips. It hides the secrets no one wants to face. And through it all, the survivors endure. The mother of a child killed by a stray bullet. The sister of a man falsely branded a militant. The father who visits the same police station every week, hoping for a sign. They endure not because they are fearless, but because they have no choice. Their resilience is not heroic. It is forced upon them by a history that refuses to heal. What makes these tragedies even more painful is the world's indifference. These are not ancient events. They are recent. They are real. And they are documented. But they are rarely spoken of in global forums, rarely shown in international media. Instead, they are buried under labels: national interest, internal matter, counterinsurgency. As if human suffering has borders. As if justice has a flag. And yet, the valley remembers. In poems, in art, in memorials scratched into walls, in tears that fall silently during evening prayers. The stories are passed on, not in textbooks, but in kitchens between generations. And every time a child asks why there's so much sadness in their mother's eyes, the story begins again. But these stories are not meant to paralyze. They are meant to awaken. Because behind each massacre, each assault, each disappearance, is a truth that demands to be seen. The truth that Kashmir is not just a place. It is a people, a pain, a plea. And until these tragedies are acknowledged, until justice is served, not with compensation, but with accountability, there can be no peace. These are not untold stories because no one knows them. They are untold because too many choose not to hear. And yet, despite the silence of the world, Kashmir speaks. Through candles lit on anniversaries, through peaceful processions, through court petitions filed again and again, even after decades, through voices like Parvina Hanger, the Iron Lady of Kashmir, who founded the Association of Parents of Disappeared Persons, and who still walks the streets of Srinagar holding a picture of her lost son. She is not alone. There are thousands like her, and they are not just fighting for their loved ones. They are fighting for memory itself, because memory in Kashmir is a form of resistance. It says, we remember, we refuse to forget. We will not let the world look away. It was the morning of August 5th, 2019, but in Kashmir, it felt like the sky had collapsed. The air was unusually quiet, too quiet. No phones rang. No internet worked. The streets were empty. Schools were shut. Shops closed. TV screens outside Kashmir flashed breaking news. Article 370 had been abrogated. Kashmir had lost what little autonomy it had left. But inside the valley, the people heard nothing because their voices, their lines of communication, and their entire connection to the outside world had been severed overnight. It was not just the internet that was cut, it was trust. Article 370 had once promised that Kashmir would have its own constitution, its own flag, its own rules except in matters of defense, foreign affairs, and communications. It was a legal bridge between Kashmir and the Indian Union, a promise of partnership. That promise had now been broken, without consent, without debate, without warning. Over 40,000 additional troops had been deployed in the valley days before the announcement. Tourists were asked to leave. Pilgrims were evacuated. Local leaders were placed under house arrest. It was as if the storm knew it was coming, and the people it would hit were the last to be told. In the days that followed, the valley entered a darkness deeper than night. People couldn't call their families. Children couldn't reach schools. Patients couldn't speak to doctors outside the state. Journalists couldn't report. Activists disappeared. Every street had an armed soldier, every lane a checkpoint. It wasn't just a security lockdown. It was a silencing of an entire population. The world watched, but only partially. Government voices called it a historic move, a bold decision, a final integration. But for the people of Kashmir, it felt like an erasure of their identity, their history, their voice. Article 370 wasn't just a constitutional clause. It was a symbol, fragile as it may have become, of dignity and recognition. Stripping it away in the silence of night was not reform. It was rupture. And the silence that followed, it wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. Schools remained shut for months. Internet returned slowly. First 2G, then filtered access. But the damage was already done. Students lost a year of education. Businesses collapsed. Medical services were paralyzed. Families were split, unable to call or check on each other. And through it all, the valley was painted as normal. But ask a shopkeeper in Lal Chowk. Ask a mother in Pulwama. Ask a teenager in Baramulla. What does normal mean when you are not even allowed to speak? The irony is that while Kashmir was being told it was now fully integrated, it had never felt more isolated. Political leaders who had once defended the Union, who believed in dialogue, were now behind bars. Mainstream was no longer mainstream. It was criminalized. Dissent wasn't debated. It was detained. The psychological impact of August 5th was immense. Imagine being told that your identity, your history, your voice in a federal structure has been erased overnight, and you don't even get a chance to respond. Imagine the message that sends to a young Kashmiri growing up amidst all this, that his voice doesn't matter, that her future will be decided without her. But Kashmiris are not new to betrayal. They have carried the burden of broken promises since 1947. What August 5th did was not begin a new story. It simply added another scar to an already wounded land. And yet, through the fog of fear, hope refuses to die. Even in the silence, there are whispers. In homes, in hearts, in art. Kashmiris continue to resist, not with weapons, but with memory, with words, with defiance stitched into the very soul of the land. A poet once wrote, "You can silence a voice, but not the wind that carries it." Young boys and girls continue to write, paint, organize, learn. They dream, not because it is easy, but because it is necessary. Because giving up would be the final victory of silence. And the question remains, how long can this silence be sustained? How long can entire people be kept locked behind curfews, bans, and blackouts? How long can the world look away? Because the world must understand, Kashmir is not a trophy. It is not a map to be redrawn or a statistic to be quoted. It is a beating heart, a living culture, a voice that has survived decades of violence, betrayal, and suppression. And one day, that voice will rise, not in anger, but in truth, because truth has a way of breaking through even the thickest silence. Because the story of Kashmir is not over. It is still being written, in whispered prayers and shouted slogans, in hidden diaries and defiant poems, in the eyes of a mother who has lost everything but her faith, and in the heartbeat of a valley that refuses to forget. Kashmir is still waiting, waiting for justice, waiting for peace, waiting for the day when a mother doesn't flinch at a knock on the door, when a child can draw a sky without helicopters, when poetry can return to the lips of a people who have only known silence. This isn't just a documentary. It's a mirror, a reminder, a testimony for those who cannot speak or are not allowed to. Don't let this story fade into the mist. Let the world know what it refused to see. Subscribe to History Vault. Share this truth. Be the voice for those who were silenced. Because one day, when history is written again, it should remember who stood for Kashmir.